Magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworld.eldar.com. I'm Brent and this is the unit focus video on warp spiders. In these unit focus videos, I talk about what the unit is, its role on the table, obstacles to using it effectively, and how to play around those obstacles. Now, warp spiders are without a doubt, from a competitive perspective, one of the best aspect warriors in 10th edition 40k, despite having their points raised, I think, twice since the beginning of the edition because they are so good. They're still highly competitive. They're still excellent at 125 points for 5 warp spiders. And this is because they are so versatile, and because their versatility also comes with being what's called a high skill cap unit, which means in the hands of a highly skilled player, warp spiders perform remarkably. In the hands of an intermediate player, warp spiders are kind of okay. That's what a high skill cap means. It's if you play them more skillfully, they return dividends. And you might think, well, surely all units are like that, but no, there are some units that are just so simple and straightforward that, like, somebody who wins GTs is not really going to be using them in a different way or getting more out of them than some player who maybe would be a lower mid-table GT player or doesn't go to tournaments or whatever. Some units just kind of are what they are, but not so warp spiders. Warp spiders are an enormously nuanced unit that can do a lot of different things for you. They can be a target elimination unit, both into hordes and hard targets. The ability to multi-class into hard targets is one of the things that puts them over the edge. I'll talk about that later. Because they're so fast, they may be the fastest and reliably fastest, maybe infantry unit in the game. Certainly the most reliably fast infantry unit in the game that does not have to advance, which means they're free to perform all sorts of actions. They're an incredibly powerful scoring unit. They can multi-class into character assassination if a character is left sort of on their own, undefended, but out of line of sight behind something, while the warp spiders can maybe get in there and put that character down. They're also they can be a technical piece for things like move blocking. They've gotten a little bit expensive to function in that role, but I will talk a little bit about how that works. And the first trick to using warp spiders effectively is to plan ahead for the sorts of things that they're going to do and deploy them accordingly. But first, I'm going to talk about their combat role, because I think that when I'm talking about moving them, already being able to think about what they can do in shooting will be useful, and also because lots of newer players start with looking at data sheets for what the models can kill, and that's fun. So let's start by taking a look at the data sheet, and I'll run you through their general stats and how exactly they fight. So warp spiders have the sort of standard Exarch stat line, but obviously with a higher move statistic because they have those warp generators on their back. So they've got a movement of 12, but they're T3 with a 3-up save, and they've got the 5-up invuln for being aspect warriors. The Exarch has an extra wound. But again, aside from the 12-inch movement, that's sort of the standard stat line. And then they have a really cool ranged weapon, the Death Spinner, which we're asked to imagine pierces the target with razor-sharp monofilament webs. The Eldari like their razor-sharp stuff coming out of their firearms. The Death Spinner has a very limited range at 12 inches, but ends up not really being an issue because warp spiders have an ability that lets them move 24, which I'll talk about a little bit later. They fire D6 shots, which is cool. No blast. They have torrents, so they're going to hit automatically, so there's no ballistic skill on it. And that D6 shots, when they're hitting automatically, that's kind of like D6 plus 1 or 2 shots where you would have to roll to hit. So it's actually more shots than it sounds like. Strength 4, okay, no AP, but devastating wounds. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Brent, I mean, the Death Spinner is a pretty good profile against hordes of poorly armored Tyranids or something. But even auto hitting, that's just not that It's not that powerful against stuff with armor because 5 warp spiders, because the Exarch has 2 death spinners, will put out 6d6 shots, which is an average of about 20, and they all hit. But then if they're targeting something that's T4, only half of them are going to wound. And then if the target has armor, if it's decent armor, most of those shots are going to ping off the armor. So you might do 3 or 4 wounds. And then if it's something like Tyranids, though, with sort of crappy armor where they would wound on 3s, maybe you could kill like 9 or 10 cheap bugs. But surely that's not a reason to pay 125 points, Brent. And I say to you, newer / intermediate player who plays one game every 2 to 3 months, I get why you think that. I actually kind of thought that too at the beginning of the edition. I was much more excited about Swooping Hawks, which also have some cool movement shenanigans as a scoring unit, and Warp Spiders just seemed kind of expensive. But it turns out that shooting profile is actually way better than it initially appears. And this is because of the devastating wound keyword. So the fact that you're auto hitting with all of their shots and they're putting out quite a lot of shots means that you're making quite a lot of wound rolls, which means that you're going to put through 3 or 4 devastating wounds in addition to all of your other wounds that will just bypass armor saves. So they end up doing pretty decent damage to a heavily armored unit or something even with a good invuln save. And if you come up against something that is not especially armored, like a squadron of guardsmen or something like that, yeah, you can pick the squad up. But really what makes the Death Spinner so useful, again, that devastating wounds and volume of fire means Warp Spiders are actually pretty good. They can do a chunk of damage to something really tough. So, for example, the Avatar of Cain freaking hates these things in mirror matches. The Avatar of Cain has is extremely tough, and if it has Fortune on it, it's -1 to wound, so it's even tougher, and it saves on a 2-up, and it also has a 4-up invuln, and it also halves incoming damage. But if you put a bunch of Warp Spiders next to the Avatar of Cain, and they just light it up, they're going to do like 3 or 4 mortal wounds to the Avatar, or devastating wounds to the Avatar. The Avatar gets no saving throw, just takes that damage, doesn't reduce it. It doesn't matter how tough it is because you're only really worried about putting through the devastating wounds. And if you also, I don't know, the ability to push through devastating wounds on something like that is great. So if you have a unit of Warp Spiders and you also have like, I don't know, an Autarch who you could, who also has a jump pack, like the Autarch Wayleaper, who you could move next to the same target and chuck a grenade with the grenade stratagem, you can drop like 7 mortal wounds on 6 or 7 mortal wounds on something like the Avatar of Cain, before then having to try to finish it off with things like Brightline. I should make a whole video on how to kill the Avatar of Cain, but I think you get it. And for a lot of people who have been trying to make Warp Spiders work and just haven't really been able to figure out how to make the combat angle work, generally the secret ends up being realizing that the volume of fire on the Death Spinner with the devastating wounds means they can reliably do a chunk of damage to something really tough in a way that like maybe a Bright Lance can't, because you can always whiff against the invuln save, and that's great. On its own, it would not be a good enough reason to take them, but it is a solid tool. The other combat utility that they have, of course, is their melee weapons. Now, the regular Warp Spiders don't have anything. They're Aspect Warriors, so they have 2 attacks, but they just have the standard crappy profile. But the Exarch has Power Blades. These things have 3 attacks. They hit on 3s. They're Strength 4, -2 AP, not bad. They do a damage. You're not going to end up using the Power Blades a ton for the simple reason that if you do their crazy 24-inch move, which I'll explain in just a moment, you cannot then charge. So typically the only time Warp Spiders end up fighting is when they get charged. But the Exarch has a decent little punchback against a modest combat unit that engages them and kills some Aspect Warriors, or tries to kill some Aspect Warriors. But as I said initially, the reason to take Warp Spiders is really not primarily for their combat utility. That combat utility, that shooting profile is really good. And again, the other thing that the Devastating Wounds will do for you, I mentioned character assassination. So characters that have like 3 or 4 wounds, but a pretty good invuln save, and maybe it can be -1 to hit or something, like Warp Spiders can assassinate a character like that pretty easily because you just bypass, there's volume of fire there, and you bypass, you auto hit, and then you bypass the invuln save with some Devastating Wounds. If in addition that character fails a save or two, your Warp Spiders can easily put 5 or 6 wounds on a character and just pick it up. And even just like the threat of that makes it very difficult for your opponent to play with key support characters the way that maybe they want to. Okay, but what really makes Warp Spiders a clutch unit is their scoring potential, which is really all around their movement shenanigans. So their movement shenanigans come from their datasheet ability, Flicker Jump. So I mentioned that they have a movement characteristic of 12, but they have this ability to move 24 inches. So here's how this works. You can choose to make a normal move, or you could make an advanced move, which would be 12 plus d6, or you could flicker jump. If you do, your movement characteristic becomes 24, but you've already declared that it's a normal move, so you cannot then advance. You make the move, and after you finish the move, you roll a d6, and on a 1, the unit suffers a mortal wound, because what's happening is they're like jumping into the warp, going a short distance through the warp, and bamfing out again with their crazy Eldari technology, which theoretically is like the best. But the warp is a dangerous place, and on a 1, one of the elves takes a mortal wound while they're in there. Now, if you're using the spiders for the first time and they haven't really fought yet, you always put that mortal wound on the Exarch, because then they have the same combat utility, because the Exarch has 2 wounds, right? The disadvantage is you then have to take the next wound that the squad takes on the Exarch. But generally, Warp Spiders end up being kind of a one-and-done unit pretty often anyway, so we're not really worried about that. But the 24-inch move is really clutch, because what it means is that all of those secondary scoring missions that require units to be in particular places on the board to perform some action, or maybe you have to get onto an objective in your opponent's backfield, or you have to get onto a hard-to-reach objective in the midfield, or you have to be in some quadrant, or whatever it is, right? There's a bunch of secondary missions that involve this kind of thing. Well, most armies simply don't have units that can pull a lot of those secondaries off on turn 1. Most factions need to spend the first turn sort of maneuvering, so on turn 2 they could hope to start scoring some of those high mobility secondaries, but not so Eldari. And Warp Spiders are maybe the single best unit we have for this, because they're infantry, so they can run straight through buildings, which tanks and flyers and bikes can't do. And even though we have a lot of other stuff that's fast, the difference between like 18 inches and 24 inches is significant. It's often the difference between being able to get to where you need to get to on turn 1 for scoring purposes versus having to kick it back a turn. And if you want to max out your secondary scoring, and you kind of need to as an elf player, setting up your Warp Spiders on the first turn so that if you draw into movement shenanigan secondaries, or a movement shenanigan secondary you can score it, is big. So if you really want to get the most out of these elves, here's what I suggest. You want to deploy them in a place such that they are close enough to the front of your deployment zone that they can get to anywhere they might need to get to score for you on the first turn. So you need to familiarize yourself with the secondary objectives and work out, like, I could draw this or this or this, and ask yourself, like, can my Warp Spiders be in the places that they would need to be to score those things? Now, you need to be out of line of sight, but close enough to the front of your deployment zone that you can do this. Now, remember, in tournament play, terrain in your deployment zone that faces your opponent always has an opaque first floor, and aspect warriors are short, so you can have them in the first floor of some building pretty close to the edge of your deployment zone. They will not be visible to your opponent. And ideally, you will position them such that if you draw into a scoring mission on turn 1, your warp spiders can also be positioned such that they can shoot with their death spinners some target that is an ideal target. Either wipe out some horde unit that they're, or highly damage some horde unit that they're very effective into, or often better yet, like put some hurt on something that's really tough by spamming it with some devastating wounds. Now, this particular utility got slightly nerfed in the last Balanced Data Slate update, because it used to be the case that devastating wounds were not subject to abilities that gave units saves against mortal wounds. Like Custodes are pretty robust against mortal wounds in some cases. And that rule has been altered, which is completely reasonable, such that there may be units in the game that have a save against your devastating wounds. That may be something to take into account. And then lastly, ideally, they would also be able to block the movement of some enemy, I don't know, ground transport or big monster or something. So a really ideal first turn with warp spiders is they bamf somewhere to score a positioning secondary, or maybe in some cases an action secondary. If possible, if it's positioning secondary, if possible, they then shoot a target, which is a pretty decent target for them, and then also ideally engage in some move blocking. That would be like it would be the perfect opening round with warp spiders. Now, maybe you don't draw into that sort of secondary on turn 1, in which case don't feel like you have to get them right into the fight. They don't need to get right into the fight. In very early editions of 40K, there was a premium placed on just shooting with more of your army than your opponent was shooting with at a more advantageous angle. And if you've come back to the game after like not having played since 3rd ed or something, then you're going to find it really sort of startling that the tactics of the game are completely different now. But a lot of the game now is about pacing, knowing when to commit what. And generally you don't commit your warp spiders until you have one of these scoring secondaries, or until you need to reach some primary objective that would be difficult to reach, unless you're using them to assassinate a character, or in some insane circumstance in which you have to throw them away to move block, which again, at 125 points is probably too steep in almost all cases. But sometimes holding them back for a combat play also makes sense. Again, like in a mirror match, if you know that your opponent is going to push forward with an Avatar of Cain and you want to wait till turn 2 when you can put the hurt on the Avatar with a combination of the warp spiders, the grenade stratagem, maybe the tank shock stratagem, hit it with a D cannon to automatically trigger devastating wounds and push through D6+2 halved if you use a fate die. Incidentally, there will also be cases when it makes sense to use the Phantasm stratagem on these elves. If they've really got a stretch for some sort of turn 1 scoring opportunity, sometimes then you can use Phantasm at the end of your opponent's movement phase to like run through a wall and have them be out of line of sight. And if they're pretty close to a wall and you only need to roll like a 2 for it to work, or even a 3, it's likely worth doing. And this is actually probably a good moment to transition to talking about challenges to playing them effectively, because really the Phantasm trick, I guess, is a way around the eventuality that the spiders will be killed the first time they do a thing, which often happens and often also is not a problem. In a well-balanced list, some of your resources will be disposable. There are some lists in which all of the resources are disposable, although not usually craft world lists. So we'll talk obstacles to playing warp spiders well. There's like 2 of them. One is deploying them poorly, but I've already talked about how to deploy them. If you deploy them too far back, or you deploy other stuff first and then you didn't leave a place for your warp spiders and you can't put them where they would need to be to have their turn 1 utility, like then you're paying 125 points for something that's going to be hard maybe to get full value out of, because you're paying 125 points because of what they can do on turn 1. And the other obstacle to them using them effectively is just that they are fragile, and so they're especially vulnerable to Overwatch, you've got to be pretty careful of any torrent weapons. And it's okay to ask your opponent, too, if you're a newer player, like, do you have anything that auto hits on Overwatch, or do you have any bonuses to hit with Overwatch before the game starts, or like in your movement phase? That's a completely reasonable thing to ask. And then don't move your warp spiders within line of sight and Overwatch range of something that's just going to massacre them after their move. And I guess the only other real obstacle to, I guess it's not an obstacle to using them effectively, but to including them in a list would be their relative cost to other units that perform a sort of similar role, right? So they're significantly more expensive than Swooping Hawks, which operate in a kind of similar role for 40 points less. And Swooping Hawks are very fast. They have a regular move characteristic of 14 inches. They can advance, and if you use a fate die or a stratagem, they can automatically move 20 inches. And then at the end of your opponent's turn, they can go back into deep strike so that on your turn, they can deep strike in. And that might make them seem initially even more mobile than the warp spiders, because they move almost as far potentially, and then they can do their deep strike thing. But here's the thing. In order to make Swooping Hawks get even close to warp spider movement, you automatically have to either spend a CP, which are at a premium as an Eldari player, or use a fate die roll of a 6. We don't have a ton of those. And that still only gets you to 20 inches. There is, like, when you're figuring out for scoring purposes and where deployment zones are and everything, there's a big difference on turn 1 between 20 and 24 inches. Hawks just don't have the same turn 1 scoring utility. And as far as like jumping the Hawks out and then bringing them in out of deep strike, well, Hawks might be very effective in that role against like newer and lower intermediate players who they're just trying to remember what all their stuff does, and they're not thinking about screening their backfield. But a skilled, like, intermediate to advanced tournament player will deploy such that there are no gaps between her units of more than 18 inches in the backfield. So there's literally, and the edge of the field, so there's literally nowhere for an opponent to bring anything in out of deep strike, and they will know what your unit can do, and they will simply screen out your Hawks. Now, having deep strikers makes your opponent do that. That's worthwhile. But don't assume that the Hawks redeploy ability means that they're going to be able to get where they need to be. On the other hand, your opponent can't prevent you from just moving like 24 inches just through stuff with flicker jump. Warp spiders also have the fly keyword in the jump pack keyword. And lastly, although Hawks have quite good shooting with their lethal hits and their volume of fire, they're not auto hitting with torrent. They don't have the devastating wounds thing. They're not as effective into the same types of targets. They're great against hordes. They have better range, and because they have lethal hits, they too can ding something tougher, but not as effectively. And that's why you pay so much more for warp spiders. Hawks are great too. And I think there's a really strong argument for having one of each, but it's not totally crazy to consider spending the extra points on spiders, even though it is kind of a big jump up. Theoretically, the other unit that could compete is the Viper. The Viper, like the Hawks, has a 14-inch move, and like the Hawks can also get to 20 and has the advantage of being only 75 points after a point reduction. And it's a little bit more durable. It's got a hull. It's kind of a light tank. It can carry a heavy weapon. It's a solid unit. But I just want to stress again, the difference is warp spiders can go 24 inches on turn 1, and it counts as a normal move, and they can do so while moving straight through terrain. And that's really what makes them different from these other fast, much cheaper scoring units, is they can move 24 inches straight through terrain out of the gate. And there's really just a significant difference between those two things. And I think if you play with them a little bit, you will see that this is true. Now, I will say that at 125 points instead of the 115 that they used to cost, and possibly even less at the beginning of the edition, I think we've reached a point where, at least for me, warp spiders are probably a one-off in a list. Again, so I do have those turn 1 options, and then maybe I want to get the same job done with cheaper units later in the game. I'm sure there are veteran players out there who will run 2 units. I kind of don't think we're at 3 anymore. People were doing that. And I also don't think you really ever want to consider running the double size squad. I think it's 5, really. Because 250 points for 10 of these things, I mean, it's a neat tool, but it's not survivable. And also just having all those bases makes it difficult to fit in places for scoring purposes and whatnot. So that's what I've got. If you're going to run Warp Spiders, I think 1 unit, position it towards the front of your deployment zone. Make sure you already know what the movement shenanigans secondaries are. Position them such that they can make use of those while also posing a threat to some key enemy unit. Think about move blocking if you can. Remember that the devastating wounds makes them a particular threat to units that are extremely tough and rely on like a really good armor save and maybe also damage reduction because you can't reduce 1 damage, or characters with good invuln saves. Be aware of auto-hitting Overwatch fire, and maybe think carefully about how these are going to work in concert with other scoring units in your list. So like turn 1, I have my Warp Spiders. Turn 2, I have my Vipers. Turn 3, I have my Swooping Hawks. I like the Swooping Hawks in the late game because once there are fewer units on the board and your opponent can't screen as effectively, that sky leap ability is really good. So it's nice to like lead with Hawks, which can't really be blocked, or I'm sorry, with Warp Spiders, which can't really be blocked. And then you use something like a Viper in the mid game that's cheap and kind of disposable and has a turn to position itself. And then in the late game, you can potentially play with something like Hawks or even Shadow Specters, which are still good. But there are plenty of other approaches to movement-based secondary scoring also. That's just one possibility, but whatever you're doing, I think that if you're using spiders, you're probably leading with them from a scoring perspective in most matchups. So that's what I've got. If you liked the video, I hope that you will click a like. If you found it useful, I hope you will leave a comment, or if you just liked it, saying, hey, I found this useful. If you have your own ideas about how to use Warp Spiders effectively, you could mention those in the comments below. If you too own a copy of the 2nd edition Codex, which introduced them with fun little stories about weird crystalline spiders crawling around on stuff in the craft worlds and thought, neat, you can write, hey, we're old. Or if you're feeling particularly chummy, you could always join the Patreon and also get access to my Discord and some early access to content. Thank you, patrons. I hope to be back again soon with something new.